Armando, and for today's episode we're going to continue the series that we have been doing regarding the work that has been done by Doug Marcaida, who designed this magnificent sword, and it was forged by none other than Latin American Forged and Fire judge Ricardo Vilar. The more time I've had to spend with this magnificent sword, I've found even more critical details as it relates to its performance. One of those critical details which is important to Filipino martial arts practitioners is the sword's ability to go from a 12 o'clock position to a 3 o'clock position and a 9 o'clock position, meaning to go from this straight up and down heaven position and then being able to orient itself from left to right. When I work with the trainer's sword, what you will find is that when I go from this position to this position, the 3 o'clock position, or the 9 o'clock position, what you start to feel, especially if the sword is not designed for function, is that as it starts to tilt along the frontal plane, you'll start to feel some strain on the wrist, meaning the balance is not optimized for fighting. It may very well be optimized for work, field work, but not necessarily fighting. So when I move from this orientation or this orientation, just like in the first episode where we were moving from the sagittal plane, where I was trying to get a sense of when I started to feel the weight, it was much later. It doesn't create undue strain onto the wrist. But we are also finding the same exact dynamics when I allow the sword to fall from left to right. This is a very important detail as it relates to this specific sword. There's two very important things I want to point out regarding this specific feature of the sword. First one, when a sword falls from the heaven position to my left side and to my right side, reason why wrist strain is important to be mindful of if you are in any way practicing with a real sword and you're starting to experience fatigue and strain, you're probably dealing with a suboptimal sword. If we are to somehow replicate battlefield conditions in any way, fatigue is one of the critical enemies of the warrior. I can't have a sword that from the very act of wielding it all of a sudden creates fatigue. We don't experience this with this sword. So when it falls from this side or this side, it is relatively weightless. Other reason why this is important is because I'm not necessarily doing this movement because I'm looking at some sort of abanico or fan capabilities. That's not what the sword is for. What it helps me set up for are either upward strikings to redirect, upward striking to redirect, or more importantly, fulcrum striking, wherein the spine of the sword actually is supported by my entire torso as I go into the movement. This is something that is optimized if there is no strain on the wrist. So one of the key movements that I've found really effective in sparring, bridge the gap with an angle 1, possibly an angle 2. As it comes back, I am now positioned here, and as I step forward with my left leg, I can now turn, look to disarm, or look to guard this way. And that way, this sword can now either cut across the midsection or come up along the X line. That's a very critical feature of this specific sword. The second feature, and because it is so well designed, a swordsman may be tempted to use arm-centric movement. It's an interesting contradiction. The lighter it is, the more tempted you are to move away from true sword dynamics, which is fundamentally core-centric, and make it become arm-centric. Any true swordsman knows that the movement actually originates from the core before the arm actually fires for the purposes of conservation of energy. So what you want is when you have a sword, you want to be able to create some sort of tension in your core first. Once it coils, then the arm releases and the sword naturally follows. Versus a pushing motion, almost like you're doing some sort of dumbbell press or bench press. arm-centric movements tends to be, from my observation, a relatively modern phenomenon, or something that the beginner likes to use. Or thirdly, and something that I don't like to say, but is actually a big part of what's going on in FMA, in that if someone has a background primarily in stick fighting arts, you can immediately tell by giving them a sword and to see how they move. A swordsman knows to move from their core because they've spent enough time with the sword. A person who comes from a stick-oriented art is going to be using a lot of wrist movement and a lot of shoulder movement because that's just what the art demands. But most of all, the stick itself, considering how light it is, although very dangerous as an impact weapon, doesn't create the appropriate biomechanics and neuromuscular sequences to handle the sword effectively. So when you take a relatively light sword and give it to someone who comes from a stick art, you can see that this individual doesn't know how to handle a sword when their torso tends to stay relatively stable, and these are the movements that you see. This is how you know that this individual comes from a stick art, which in my opinion is suboptimal for sword work. Now, what's critical about this sword is that it is so light and it is so well balanced that somebody who comes from a stick-oriented martial art may very well be tempted to use it as a stick. This is a very big mistake. What will start to happen is that if you start to use it as a stick, and I experimented with it in my first couple of days, is that your shoulder actually starts to fatigue. I started to feel it in my shoulder, not in a bad way. I just started to feel it kind of contract, and you start to get a pump in the shoulder, which is really uncharacteristic. And I thought to myself, hey, what gives? You've worked with swords before. How come this is happening to your shoulder? It's because it's so light. And because it's so light, you're just kind of tempted to go, oh, abanico, oh, redondo, oh, let's go do some stick stuff. That's not what this is for. This is still very much a sword. And the ingenuity of the design and the beauty of the design is really accentuated when it goes from the sagittal plane, where a Filipino sword will normally start to fall forward. Right about here, it doesn't. It stays very still. A swordsman with a very high kinesthetic awareness will know that right about here, with the right sensitivity, the core has to coil. It's the same exact thing that happens here when it goes from the heaven position into these fulcrum power assisted positions, so that right about here that core has to start to take over. This is a very important detail about this sword, and it is a true testament to the craftsmanship, the keen eye of both Doug Marcaida and Ricardo Vilar. They have delivered, in my opinion, a true masterwork in this sword. Just a couple of more points with regards to fulcrum sword work and power assist, because there's a critical difference. And it's something that I'm going to point out in my demonstrations. When you're looking at fulcrum assisted sword work, is that as it starts to fall here, you should start to think that my lead shoulder now has to give way to my rear shoulder, so that my rear shoulder is about to meet this spine. Because as I meet this spine, it can start to assist in that movement. That's fulcrum assisted, meaning my torso is assisting with the cut. Power assist, when the sword is moving a certain way, what we're trying to do to fulfill a specific beat structure, if this is 1 and a 2, this is 1 and a, meaning 1 and a 2, so that is 1 beat and then 2 beat. This is 1, and here comes the half beat because I'm going to push, and that is the power assist. Please take a look at this video and all of my videos as part of a martial movement self-perfection curriculum, meaning when I move with the sword, I'm moving with it from the perspective of health, because it is my opinion and based on my experience that when you create multiplanar movements with a high level of kinesthetic awareness, your brain is working better, your body is working better, moving in neural pathways that your body is probably not used to, but is exactly designed for. And I'm probably going to do a separate video on that, so keep an eye out for that. And I'm glad that this sword kind of reminded me to do a video on that, because it's about time. Thank you very much for letting me share this video. I really hope you enjoy it. One of the key assumptions of Filipino martial arts is that the training with the stick allows the practitioner to have transferable skills and attributes into the handling of other combat weapons such as swords and knives. Although I think this assumption does lead the practitioner into effective and proficient use of the stick as a combative weapon, I think what it also does is it prepares the practitioner for general athleticism that could be used for sword work, but it is not specific enough for the effective use of swords. I think we can take a look at the movements that we are seeing here that are technically stick specific, but we're not going to see that transfer over well once we are using a sword. For example, this is a wooden barong sword and we're using the same combinations that we have seen before. However, when we do this abanico movement, you can see that although it works well as a stick, it only hits the target with the flat of the blade and not with the edge itself. It doesn't cut the target down, but it does hit it. And I don't think that's the effect that we want when we're using a sword. So we can also start to see some movements where it is no longer efficient because along the wrist and along the shoulder, I can personally start to feel some strain in my body when I try to use a wooden barong as if it were a stick. So when I do these overhead abanico movements, it's very obvious that that's not what it's designed for. It's designed for sword movements, where I can set it up for fulcrum movements and I can align that sword with my shoulder so my torso can actually fire that shot across. This is something you don't necessarily see with stick work. And the other piece of movement that we can start to see is what's called the power assist, where I start to put my hand right on the wrist and I use the framing capabilities of my torso so that my hand pushes on my wrist and it shoots right across into that target. This is something that we ought to start thinking about when it comes to our Filipino martial arts training. I'm now going to start the same exact stick combination that I used earlier onto the Itak sword that Doug Marcaida and Ricardo Vilar had designed. And it's very obvious that I'm holding a sharp sword and it just doesn't transfer over. If you're looking to train with a sword and looking to create the skill sets and attributes for it, train specifically with the sword and with sword movements. And for my preference, I like to use the Tatang Ilustrisimo methodology, where it is indexed along the rib to keep the hand from getting hit mid-trap retraction, so I can maintain neutral shoulder position so that I can facilitate tall posture for better range management and defense. The Tatang Ilustrisimo system is very centerline oriented and the striking is relatively rudimentary, but its footwork, timing, beat structure is highly sophisticated because it optimizes body posture so that I can better create sophisticated beat structures with fulcrum striking, closing the distance, and power assist. On the subject of footwork, what we're going to cover today is the signature footwork of Ilustrisimo called lutang. Lutang in Tagalog means to float, so one foot floats as a counterbalance for the strike, but also facilitates a closing the distance called the hakbang. Hakbang is a measuring step, so after I strike, I float from the lutang and close with the hakbang so that I can now start to use very effective close quarters, fulcrum strikes, and power assists. So I use a power assist, but first, before I do any of that, I like to calibrate my core with very slow movements so that there's an easy transition between core-centric movements and arm-centric movements. So this is relatively slow. One of the important things to note about Tatang Ilustrisimo is that he was relatively slow in his movement because he was very deliberate and intentional when it came to his striking. But once he was positioned, all of a sudden a power assist strike would go out from an angle you did not expect. One of the key reasons why it is hard to calibrate and expect what kind of angle you can be hit with in the Ilustrisimo system is because of that neutral shoulder position. That neutral shoulder position allows my left hand or my left arm to position itself at any given time to all of a sudden fire off a power assist or a fulcrum strike. So one of the reasons why it is a very centerline oriented system is not only so that the sword is positioned optimally, but so that my left hand is positioned optimally or my left shoulder positioned optimally so that I can fire off and power assist or a fulcrum strike. So note how my left hand is always positioned right there, push off on my right wrist, and that allows me to all of a sudden fire off that strike at a beat structure that the opponent did not expect. But it also allows me to cover a lot of distance because as I push off, it actually pulls my body forward. That's one of the powers and one of the secrets of the Tatang Ilustrisimo system. One of the ways that they manage distance and the way they manage footwork, also power, is through that power assist and fulcrum mechanism. So when you happen to be moving with a Tatang Ilustrisimo practitioner and you're sparring with them, keep an eye out for that left hand, because that left hand, once it hits center line, is going to shoot that sword out or that stick out. God forbid you're sparring with a Tatang Ilustrisimo practitioner with the sword. Take a look at that footwork, take a look at that lutang, how it covers the hakbang, it covers the measure, and that's what makes this Ilustrisimo system really optimized for sword work, because of that really seamless movement between footwork, shoulder transitions, so that the power assists and the fulcrums are actually optimized for sword work. Let's take a look at how that can also play out in close quarters. So in close quarters training, one of the ways that we can get out of close quarters is through that thrust. Now we are starting to use that optimal body mechanism with the squared shoulders and hips, so that when I thrust, it really goes through with a lot of efficiency. I can optimize it with the use of the left hand, but I am hiding the intentions of that left hand with that guard. These changes in guard position also allows me to change my angles of attack and allow the sword to do all the work. Let's watch Kuya Doug demo with the sword.
Do all the work. Now, if I go deeper in that, now I'm going to try to cut through. And when I'm cutting through with this media, I'm just going to use this and follow the arc of the blade, but knowing the range of your weapon. Knows how deep you can cut with it. And the range is just to let it drop. Oh, look at that!
A big part of the reason why that watermelon didn't completely fall through is, as Kuya Doug mentioned in the video, is that the entire blade had not been used because of the long range. This is why the Ilustrisimo system and most Filipino martial arts sword systems focus on closing that gap so that we can get inside. And once we're inside, we can then use fulcrum striking to use the entirety of that blade and to become highly efficient and effective in the use of the sword. I think this is one of the key things to consider when we're looking at fulcrum striking and closing that distance, so that we can use the entire blade so that it can be as effective as possible. Working in a training paradigm that uses specific and efficient biomechanics that becomes the support system for a very well-made sword allows the sword to do its work with very minimal effort. The only effort that needs to be done by the practitioner is to ensure that their biomechanics, their posture, their timing, their beat structure, and their footwork are all in place so that the sword is set up for success. Training in a sword-specific FMA methodology allows you to apply advanced technique just like the ballistic fulcrum strike, which can be thrown from long range and is highly non-telegraphic. It is one of my favorite techniques because you can pull it off during a carenza, but from long range, all of a sudden you can just throw this sword cut when nobody can really see what you're doing. Also, it is not arm-centric, so from out of nowhere, you can just throw this cut just by rotating your shoulders and just taking that initial step. Working with a Filipino martial art that is sword-based really opens your eyes to the real capabilities of Filipino martial arts. I, along with my subscribers, are very grateful to Dwayne Rowe, Ricardo Vilar, and Kuya Doug Marcaida for loaning me this sword for this channel. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.